What would you do if you discovered that a 4-year-old child in your community was being systematically tortured for 10 straight days? As parents, neighbors, community members, we all believe we would step in, right? We would notice the signs, make the call, save the child. We tell ourselves we are different. We tell ourselves we would never let something like this happen on our watch. But what happens when every adult who should protect a child does not? Today's case will show you exactly how a perfect storm of neglect, willful blindness, and system failures led to one of the most heartbreaking child murder cases in recent history. It was July 2010 in Johnston County, North Carolina. The summer heat pressed down on the rural landscape like a heavy blanket. Tobacco fields stretched endlessly under the blazing sun, and the small community of Smithfield carried on with its quiet, predictable rhythm. Children played in backyards. Families gathered for barbecues. Life moved at the gentle pace that small-town America is known for. But in a converted barn behind a modest home, something horrific was unfolding. 4-year-old Teghan, a little girl who should have been playing with toys, watching cartoons, and experiencing the simple joys of childhood, was trapped in a nightmare that no human being, let alone a defenseless child, should ever endure. Teghan's story is not just about one monster who chose violence. It is about a system that failed at every level. It is about warning signs that went unnoticed. It is about adults who made choices that sealed a child's fate. It is about a community that had no idea what was happening just miles from their homes. This case will challenge everything you think you know about child protection. It will force you to confront uncomfortable questions about responsibility, accountability, and the price of looking the other way. If this case teaches us anything about protecting children in our communities, hit that subscribe button right now, because what you are about to learn could save a life. Over the next hour, we will examine every detail of this tragic case. We will explore the background that led to this moment. We will follow the investigation that revealed the shocking truth, and we will discuss the lessons that every parent, neighbor, and community member needs to understand. But first, we need to go back to the beginning. We need to understand how a precious little girl named Teghan ended up in the hands of a man who would become her worst nightmare. To understand how this tragedy happened, we need to examine the foundation that was built long before July 2010. Teghan's story does not begin with violence. It begins with a series of small compromises, poor decisions, and warning signs that were either missed or ignored. Teghan was born in 2006 into a world that was already unstable. Her father, whose name remains largely absent from court records, was incarcerated on drug-related charges when she was just a toddler. This left her mother, Helen Reyes, to navigate single parenthood alone. Helen Reyes was a young woman trying to balance multiple responsibilities. She was a member of the Army Reserve, which meant she had military obligations that took her away from home. She was also struggling financially, working to support herself and her daughter without a stable partner or strong family support system. Have you ever made a decision under pressure that you later regretted? Most of us have. When you are overwhelmed, stressed, and desperate for help, it becomes easy to convince yourself that less than ideal solutions are acceptable. This is exactly what happened to Helen Reyes. Enter Jonathan Richardson, a young man who seemed to offer the companionship and support that Helen desperately needed. But Richardson brought with him a collection of red flags that should have served as warning signs. Richardson had a documented history of volatile behavior. He had struggled with anger management throughout his adolescence and young adulthood. Court records show that he had previous encounters with law enforcement, though the specifics of these incidents were not fully disclosed during the trial. What we do know is that those who knew Richardson described him as unpredictable and prone to outbursts. But perhaps the most concerning red flag was Richardson's living situation. He had moved into a converted barn behind his grandparents' home in Smithfield, North Carolina. This structure was not designed for human habitation, let alone for caring for a young child. The barn lacked basic amenities that any child needs for safety and development. There was no running water, which meant no proper bathroom facilities. The structure had inadequate heating and cooling, making it uncomfortable during both winter and summer months. The electrical system was makeshift at best, creating potential fire hazards. Most importantly, the barn was isolated from the main house, meaning that any sounds or disturbances would be difficult for neighbors or even the grandparents to hear. When Helen decided to move herself and Teghan into this barn with Richardson, she was making a compromise that put her daughter's safety at risk. But stress, financial pressure, and the desire for companionship can cloud judgment in powerful ways. The living conditions in the barn created an environment where abuse could flourish undetected. The isolation meant that Teghan's cries for help would go unheard. The lack of proper facilities meant that normal childhood accidents, like wetting herself or having toileting issues, became sources of frustration rather than normal parts of child development. Richardson's behavior toward Teghan began to show concerning patterns even before the final tragic events. Neighbors later reported that they occasionally heard shouting coming from the barn area, though they could not make out specific words. Some witnesses recalled seeing Richardson become visibly agitated when Teghan would cry or act like a typical 4-year-old child. Helen Reyes's decision-making during this period reveals another critical warning sign. Despite witnessing Richardson's short temper and his inappropriate responses to normal childhood behavior, she continued to trust him with Teghan's care. When military obligations required her to travel, she viewed Richardson as her only option for childcare. This is where we see how small compromises in child safety can compound into catastrophic failures. First, the decision to live in an unsuitable environment. Then the decision to ignore warning signs about Richardson's temperament. Finally, the decision to leave a vulnerable child alone with someone who had already demonstrated concerning behavior. What warning signs should every parent and community member recognize? Adults who become disproportionately angry at normal childhood behavior. Living situations that isolate children from potential help. Caregivers who view children as burdens rather than responsibilities requiring patience and love. The tragedy is that many of these warning signs were visible to others in the community, but our society often operates under the assumption that family situations are private matters. We tell ourselves that parents know what is best for their children. We avoid getting involved in situations that seem uncomfortable or complicated. Drop a comment if you have ever seen red flags that made you uncomfortable. Your instincts matter more than you realize. The feeling that something is not right often proves to be accurate. By the summer of 2010, all the elements for disaster were in place. An overwhelmed mother, a volatile caregiver, an unsuitable living environment, and a 4-year-old child who had no way to protect herself or ask for help. What happened next would test every system designed to protect children and reveal just how catastrophically those systems can fail. In early July 2010, Helen Reyes received orders that would change everything. The Army Reserve required her to attend critical training exercises in New Mexico. This was not optional. Military obligations do not bend to personal circumstances, and Helen faced a choice that thousands of military parents confront. Who would care for her child while she fulfilled her duty to her country? For most parents, this decision involves grandparents, trusted family members, or established childcare providers. But Helen's options were limited. Her family support system was minimal, and professional childcare for an extended period was financially out of reach. This left Jonathan Richardson as her only apparent solution. The decision to leave 4-year-old Teghan alone with Richardson for 10 days was the critical moment that transformed all the previous warning signs into a deadly reality. Helen later testified that she believed Richardson was capable of caring for Teghan, despite his documented anger issues and the unsuitable living conditions in the barn. This is where you might be thinking, where was everyone else? This question cuts to the heart of how child protection failures occur. Helen's military unit knew she was a single mother, but military regulations do not require commanders to verify childcare arrangements. Richardson's grandparents lived on the same property, but they maintained that the barn was separate from their daily lives, and they rarely interfered with what happened there. The broader community of Smithfield had no formal systems in place to monitor the welfare of children in unofficial living situations. Social services had no record of Teghan's living arrangements because no one had ever reported concerns. School officials could not track her well-being because she was not yet of mandatory school age. Here is a staggering statistic that everyone needs to understand. According to the National Center on Child Abuse and Neglect, approximately 90% of child sexual abuse cases go unreported. For physical abuse, the numbers are similarly devastating. The children who suffer the most severe abuse are often the most isolated, the most invisible to the systems designed to protect them. When Helen's plane departed for New Mexico, Teghan was left completely vulnerable in an environment where no one was monitoring her safety, no one was checking on her well-being, and no one would hear her cries for help. The 10-day period that followed represents one of the darkest chapters in modern child abuse cases. While we will not detail the specific acts of violence that occurred, court records and medical testimony paint a clear timeline of escalating abuse. Richardson's psychological state during this period reveals critical information about how abusers operate when they believe they will face no consequences. Initially, his violence appeared to be triggered by normal childhood behaviors, Teghan having toileting accidents, crying when she was hungry or scared, or simply acting like a typical 4-year-old. But Richardson's response to these normal behaviors quickly escalated beyond any reasonable form of discipline. Expert testimony during his trial indicated that his actions became more calculated and deliberate as the days progressed. This was not a case of someone losing control in a moment of frustration. This was systematic abuse that increased in severity each day. What makes this period particularly tragic is that multiple opportunities existed for intervention. The grandparents later admitted that they heard unusual sounds coming from the barn on several occasions, but chose not to investigate. Neighbors reported seeing Richardson leaving the property at odd hours, sometimes appearing agitated or distressed, but no one thought to check on the child who was supposedly in his care. The isolation of the barn meant that Teghan's suffering remained hidden from view. But isolation alone does not explain how this continued for 10 full days without discovery. It continued because our society has created a culture where we assume that family situations are private matters, even when warning signs suggest otherwise. During this same period, Helen was participating in military training exercises hundreds of miles away. She later testified that she attempted to contact Richardson several times to check on Teghan, but these calls were brief and provided no real insight into what was happening at the barn. Here is where bystander responsibility becomes critical. Every adult in that community had the power to potentially save Teghan's life. The grandparents who heard concerning sounds, the neighbors who witnessed Richardson's erratic behavior, even casual acquaintances who might have asked simple questions about how Teghan was doing. But our society teaches us to mind our own business. We are told not to interfere in family situations. We convince ourselves that surely someone else is paying attention. Someone else will intervene if something is really wrong. The reality is that children like Teghan depend entirely on adults having the courage to act when they sense something is not right. They depend on neighbors who will make uncomfortable phone calls to authorities. They depend on family members who will ask difficult questions. They depend on community members who understand that a child's safety is everyone's responsibility. As Richardson's abuse escalated during those 10 days, Teghan's physical condition deteriorated rapidly. Medical experts later testified that the injuries she sustained were consistent with prolonged systematic torture. But even as her condition became life-threatening, Richardson made no effort to seek medical help. By July 16, 2010, Teghan's injuries had become so severe that even Richardson could no longer deny that she needed immediate medical attention. His decision to finally bring her to a hospital would expose the horrific truth of what had been happening in that isolated barn. But by then, the damage was irreversible. On July 16, 2010, at approximately 2 o'clock in the afternoon, Jonathan Richardson walked through the doors of Johnston Memorial Hospital, carrying 4-year-old Teghan in his arms. What happened next would expose one of the most horrific child abuse cases that medical professionals and law enforcement officers had ever encountered. The emergency room staff at Johnston Memorial Hospital had seen their share of childhood injuries. Broken bones from code playground accidents, cuts from kitchen mishaps, burns from curious toddlers exploring their world. But when Richardson placed Teghan on the examination table, the medical team immediately recognized that they were looking at something far more serious. Dr. Patricia Williams, the attending emergency physician that day, later testified that she knew within minutes that Teghan's injuries were not accidental. The pattern, severity, and number of injuries were inconsistent with any plausible explanation that Richardson attempted to provide. Richardson told the medical staff that Teghan had fallen off a bed. He claimed that she had been acting normally earlier in the day, but had suddenly become lethargic after this supposed fall. His demeanor was nervous, and he avoided making direct eye contact with the medical staff as they examined Teghan. But the evidence told a completely different story. Teghan's body showed clear signs of systematic abuse that had occurred over an extended period. Medical examination revealed 66 distinct bite marks across her small frame. These were not random injuries. They formed patterns that indicated deliberate, repeated attacks. Forensic odontologists later matched these bite marks to Richardson's dental impressions with scientific precision. Beyond the bite marks, Teghan's body showed extensive bruising in various stages of healing. Medical professionals can determine the approximate age of bruises based on their color and characteristics. The rainbow of bruises on Teghan's body told the story of abuse that had been ongoing for days, not hours. Dr. Williams noticed defensive wounds on Teghan's hands and arms, injuries that occur when someone tries to protect themselves from attack. For a 4-year-old child to have defensive wounds painted a devastating picture of a little girl trying desperately to shield herself from violence. The medical team also discovered evidence of blunt force trauma to Teghan's head. Brain scans revealed severe swelling that indicated repeated impacts over time. This was not the result of a single fall, as Richardson claimed. This was evidence of multiple attacks that had caused progressive damage to her developing brain. Nurse Rebecca Martinez, who had worked in pediatric emergency care for over 15 years, later described her emotional response to seeing Teghan's condition. She testified that in all her years of treating injured children, she had never encountered a case that affected her so deeply. The combination of Teghan's young age, the severity of her injuries, and the clear evidence of prolonged suffering created an emotional impact that stayed with the medical staff long after that day.
Here is what medical professionals look for when identifying systematic abuse.
Physical evidence includes injuries in different stages of healing, which indicates ongoing abuse rather than a single incident. Bite marks, burns, and bruises in patterns that cannot be explained by normal childhood activities. Defensive wounds that show a child was trying to protect themselves. Internal injuries that are inconsistent with the caregiver's explanation of how they occurred. Behavioral indicators include a child who is overly compliant or fearful around adults, developmental delays that might result from chronic stress, and unusual reactions to medical examination, either extreme fear or abnormal lack of response. The medical team immediately contacted law enforcement and child protective services, as required by mandatory reporting laws. Within hours, Detective Michael Thompson from the Johnston County Sheriff's Office arrived at the hospital to begin the investigation. Detective Thompson's first step was to interview Richardson while medical staff continued working to stabilize Teghan. Richardson's story remained consistent. He claimed that Teghan had simply fallen off a bed, but experienced investigators know that truthful accounts usually contain more detail and show natural variation when repeated. Richardson's account was suspiciously brief and identical each time he told it. While Richardson was being questioned at the hospital, other investigators were dispatched to examine the barn where Teghan had been living. What they discovered there provided crucial corroborating evidence for the medical findings. The crime scene team found Teghan's blood on over 30 different objects throughout the barn. This was not the result of a single accident, as Richardson claimed. This was evidence of multiple incidents of violence that had occurred in different areas of the living space. Investigators discovered items that had clearly been used as weapons, including wooden rods, extension cords, and other household objects that showed blood evidence. The forensic team photographed and catalogued each piece of evidence, creating a comprehensive record that would later prove essential in court. Forensic science played a crucial role in building the case against Richardson. Blood spatter analysis helped investigators understand the location and intensity of different attacks. DNA testing confirmed that the blood evidence belonged to Teghan. Fingerprint analysis linked Richardson to the weapons that had been used against her. The investigation methodology in this case demonstrates how modern law enforcement approaches child abuse cases. Physical evidence is meticulously documented and preserved. Medical findings are correlated with crime scene evidence to build a comprehensive picture of what occurred. Expert testimony from medical professionals, forensic scientists, and child protection specialists helps establish both the facts of the case and the timeline of abuse. Detective Thompson later explained that the key to investigating child abuse cases is understanding that physical evidence rarely lies, even when human witnesses might be unreliable. In Teghan's case, her injuries told the complete story of what she had endured, even though she was unable to speak for herself. The investigation also revealed the systematic failures that had allowed the abuse to continue undetected. No mandatory reporters had been in contact with Teghan during the period of abuse. No welfare checks had been conducted. No community members had called authorities despite witnessing concerning signs. Share this video if you think more people need to understand these warning signs. Knowledge saves lives, and awareness creates the foundation for protection. By the end of July 16th, Richardson was in custody, and Teghan was fighting for her life in intensive care. The investigation had moved with remarkable speed, but for Teghan, it was already too late. Within hours of Teghan's arrival at Johnston Memorial Hospital, Jonathan Richardson found himself in handcuffs. The evidence against him was overwhelming, and law enforcement moved quickly to ensure he could not flee or destroy additional evidence. Richardson was initially charged with first-degree murder, felony child abuse, kidnapping, and sexual offense against a child. These charges reflected the full scope of what investigators had discovered during their examination of both Teghan's injuries and the crime scene at the barn. The legal proceedings that followed would test the strength of North Carolina's justice system and its ability to hold accountable those who harm the most vulnerable members of society. District Attorney Susan Johnson took personal responsibility for prosecuting the case. She later stated that the evidence against Richardson was among the most compelling she had encountered in her 20-year career. The combination of medical testimony, forensic evidence, and crime scene analysis created what prosecutors described as an airtight case. During the trial, the prosecution methodically presented their evidence to the jury. Medical experts testified about Teghan's injuries and their inconsistency with Richardson's claims of an accidental fall. Forensic specialists explained how blood evidence throughout the barn proved that violence had occurred in multiple locations over an extended period. The bite mark evidence proved particularly damaging to Richardson's defense. Forensic odontologists demonstrated to the jury how Richardson's dental impressions matched perfectly with the marks found on Teghan's body. This type of evidence is considered highly reliable in court because dental patterns are as unique as fingerprints. Richardson's defense team attempted to argue that their client had suffered abuse during his own childhood, which had affected his mental state and ability to control his behavior. They presented testimony about Richardson's troubled upbringing and claimed that psychological trauma had impaired his judgment. However, the prosecution successfully countered this argument by demonstrating that Richardson's actions were deliberate and calculated rather than impulsive. The systematic nature of the abuse, the attempts to conceal evidence, and Richardson's lies to medical staff all indicated someone who understood the wrongfulness of his actions. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges. Richardson showed no emotion as the verdicts were read, maintaining the same detached demeanor he had displayed throughout the trial. During the sentencing phase, the prosecution argued that the aggravating factors in this case, including Teghan's young age, the prolonged nature of the abuse, and the particularly heinous methods used, warranted the death penalty. The defense pleaded for life imprisonment, arguing that Richardson's troubled background should serve as a mitigating factor. The jury recommended death, and Judge William Matthews accepted their recommendation. Richardson was sentenced to death by lethal injection, making him one of the youngest individuals on North Carolina's death row at the time. Meanwhile, Helen Reyes faced her own legal reckoning. Prosecutors charged her with negligent child abuse, arguing that her decision to leave Teghan with Richardson despite knowing about his anger issues constituted criminal negligence. Reyes' case presented a more complicated legal question. While she had not directly harmed Teghan, her choices had created the conditions that made the abuse possible. The prosecution argued that parents have a fundamental duty to protect their children from known dangers. Reyes ultimately accepted a plea agreement and was sentenced to 18 to 31 months in prison. Her sentence reflected the court's recognition that while her negligence was serious, her culpability was significantly less than Richardson's direct acts of violence. Justice was served, but was it enough to prevent the next case? The legal system's response to Teghan's murder established important precedents for future child abuse prosecutions. The successful use of forensic evidence demonstrated how modern investigative techniques could build compelling cases even when victims cannot testify on their own behalf. The case also highlighted the legal accountability of caregivers who fail to protect children from known dangers. Reyes's conviction sent a message that parents cannot simply claim ignorance when they place their children in harmful situations. Community reaction to the verdicts was overwhelmingly supportive of the harsh sentences imposed. Local newspapers published editorials praising the thoroughness of the investigation and the severity of the punishment. Many residents expressed hope that these sentences would deter future cases of child abuse. National media coverage focused on the systematic failures that had allowed the abuse to continue undetected. News programs examined how communities could better protect vulnerable children and what warning signs should prompt intervention. Legal experts noted that the case demonstrated both the strengths and limitations of the justice system's response to child abuse. While the courts successfully held the perpetrators accountable after the fact, the system had failed to prevent the abuse from occurring in the first place. The death sentence against Richardson sparked broader discussions about capital punishment in child abuse cases. Advocates argued that the most severe penalties were appropriate for crimes against children, while others questioned whether execution truly served the goal of protecting future victims. For Teghan's extended family and the medical professionals who had tried to save her life, the verdicts provided a sense of legal closure. But they also understood that no sentence could bring back the little girl whose life had been cut short by preventable violence. The question remained, how could society translate this legal accountability into meaningful prevention? Teghan's death became a catalyst for meaningful change in child protection systems across North Carolina and beyond. The case exposed critical gaps in how society monitored and protected vulnerable children, leading to legislative action and community-driven reforms. Within 18 months of the trial, the North Carolina General Assembly passed new legislation strengthening mandatory reporting requirements. The Teghan-Skiba Child Protection Act expanded the definition of who must report suspected abuse and increased penalties for failure to report. The law specifically addressed situations where children live in non-traditional housing arrangements, requiring periodic welfare checks for children in temporary or makeshift living situations. The legislation also established new training requirements for military personnel who are parents. Army Reserve units and National Guard formations now receive annual briefings on identifying reliable childcare and recognizing signs of abuse. This training emphasizes that military obligations do not excuse parents from ensuring their children's safety. Child advocacy organizations used Teghan's case to push for broader reforms in how communities respond to warning signs. The North Carolina Coalition Against Child Abuse developed new public awareness campaigns focused on bystander intervention. These programs teach community members how to recognize concerning behaviors and provide clear steps for reporting suspicions to authorities. Local law enforcement agencies implemented new protocols for investigating reports of child welfare concerns. Johnston County Sheriff's Office established a specialized unit dedicated to child protection cases, with officers receiving advanced training in recognizing abuse patterns and interviewing techniques appropriate for young victims. Educational institutions also responded with policy changes. While Teghan was not yet school age, her case highlighted the importance of early childhood monitoring programs. North Carolina expanded its voluntary pre-kindergarten programs and increased funding for home visiting programs that connect with families before children enter formal schooling. The medical community developed new training protocols based on lessons learned from Teghan's case. Emergency room staff now receive enhanced education about documenting suspected abuse cases and coordinating with law enforcement investigators. These protocols emphasize the importance of preserving evidence while providing compassionate care to young victims. Community organizations in Johnston County established annual awareness events focused on child protection. These gatherings bring together parents, teachers, law enforcement officers, and healthcare workers to discuss current challenges and share resources for supporting vulnerable families. Perhaps most importantly, Teghan's case changed how communities think about collective responsibility for child welfare. The tragedy demonstrated that protecting children requires active engagement from neighbors, family members, and community institutions working together. These changes represent Teghan's lasting legacy, the transformation of preventable tragedy into meaningful action that protects other children. While no policy change can bring back the little girl whose life was cut short, these reforms ensure that her death contributed to saving other lives. The question now becomes, how do we maintain this commitment to child protection as time passes and memories fade? Teghan's story teaches us that protecting children is everyone's responsibility. Here are the critical warning signs that every adult must recognize. Adults who become excessively angry at normal childhood behavior, children living in unsuitable conditions without proper supervision, caregivers who isolate children from family, friends, or community contact, unexplained injuries, especially in different stages of healing, children who seem fearful around specific adults or show dramatic behavioral changes. If you suspect child abuse, take action immediately. Contact your local Child Protective Services office or call the National Child Abuse Hotline at 1-800-4A-CHILD. You can also report concerns to local law enforcement. Remember that trained professionals will investigate your concerns. Your job is simply to speak up when something feels wrong. Do not wait for someone else to make the call. Do not assume that surely someone else has already reported the situation. Your voice could be the one that saves a child's life. Teghan's tragedy reminds us that silence in the face of suspected abuse makes us complicit in the harm. Every child deserves adults who will advocate for their safety, even when it feels uncomfortable or inconvenient. Like this video, subscribe to our channel, and commit to being part of the solution. Share this story with others who need to understand these warning signs. Together, we can ensure that no child suffers in silence while adults look the other way.